Steinberg joins us, the president and COO of BuzzFeed, and of course our own John Fort joins us as well. John Fort walks in this morning to the New York Stock Exchange and says, I've got something to say about Google and this Lenovo deal.
Yeah,
You're very critical of this Google
I'm going to start with Google. Well, here's one of the first things that I thought about when I saw the news. Many people probably won't remember this. It's an ad that Google Motorola put out on the 4th of July, right before they launched the Moto X. The text at the bottom, we knew this would be a challenge. In fact, some people said it couldn't be done, but we're not just any company, and nothing this exciting ever comes easily. They were partly talking about the assembled in the USA strategy. They're employing people in Texas to build this phone. Less than 6 months later, they sell Motorola to a Chinese company that has actually demonstrated a commitment to manufacturing in the U.S. Lenovo, of course, does some business laptops in North Carolina. That's the part of this that is kind of mind-boggling for me.
You're just saying it was pure arrogance?
They did this again with the Nexus Q. It was supposed to be a music streaming product. They said it was going to be made in the USA. They launched it and then never shipped it. Sure, they can afford to do that. They're a very rich, successful company, but that's also why so many people believed in them, that they'd follow through on this, because they're rich and successful.
Fair,
they can't afford to do this.
John, they are hanging on to a lot of patents.
Yes.
Right?
So actually, the write-off is not nearly as much as people think it is.
Right.
There was $3 billion in cash. They sold the set-top box division for $2.4 billion. The patents are worth something. I forgot the point that John made about that ad. I think the explanation for why is the fact that they need to fix Android and they need to switch the bet to Samsung, basically. We see at BuzzFeed 2.5 times the usage on iOS that we see on Android devices in terms of web page consumption. That doesn't really make sense, given that Android has about 80% of the market. Samsung has 30% of all of the smartphones. So they basically need to make a concession to Samsung, work more in concert to be able to make the platform more unified and easy to use. And Absolutely. It's a write-off they need to make.
Absolutely. It makes sense. If you're an investor, you should be happy about this. I think Google stock is up 2% today. Clearly, investors are happy.
What
it's
about
a pragmatic
for Lenovo?
decision.
Are they getting a good deal?
Lenovo, if they can be as good at running this low-margin business as they had been at PCs, and they're taking on a lot with this and also IBM server business, which they are also picking up, then yes, it's a good deal for Lenovo. They're getting better prices than they would have a couple years ago. But we'll have to see. It's kind of like HP's 2008 strategy, going on big volume for low margin. We'll see if they can execute it better than HP.
Speaking of someone who knows that business at HP and the Motorola deal, our David Faber joins us this morning from Seattle. He's got some thoughts on this. I don't know, would you call it a backtrack, David?
Yeah, I think so. You know, it's interesting, Carl, of course, putting these things in the larger landscape of mergers and acquisitions, or the lack of M&A that we've talked about for so long, perhaps part of that being the fear on the part of CEOs of taking the big action. This is one company capable of saying, hey, we kind of didn't get it quite right, and moving on. There aren't that many other companies, perhaps, that could feel the strength to do that. Obviously, they've had some success in the past when it comes to M&A, certainly the likes of YouTube, for instance, comes to mind. But in this case, they kind of move on without much damage. A controlled company at Google, don't have to worry about activist investors. Obviously, it wasn't, while it was large dollar-wise, it wasn't the biggest of deals for them, given how much free cash flow they generate. Yeah. But it is perhaps a cautionary tale for others in terms of at least, getting into something that clearly did not work out as intended.
I also think that at the time they did the investment, they couldn't have foreseen what Samsung and these other players would do, that they would go and try to basically make their own operating systems on top of Android, which was something that Google couldn't have let happen. If you're Google, you want more mobile web consumption so you get more search. A rounding error of this low-margin hardware business is just not worth.
They did it.
Yeah.
And I think they did foresee that happening. They didn't want to lose control of Android, and Motorola's hardware business was potentially a way for them to put a stake in the sand and say, we're going to put out a pure version of Android on this. Don't stray too far from this. It just didn't work out.
Yeah, that's a fair point. They lost, basically, on the hardware side.
Everyone was saying they wanted the patents. They wanted those troves of patents that came along with Motorola, and they still
And the patents proved to be less valuable. The patents proved to be less valuable as well.
Is that giving them an edge?
David, it does make you wonder whether or not you should look at something like the Nest acquisition with maybe a little bit more of a skeptical eye.
You might, and I think many of their investors are willing to give Google the benefit of the doubt, Carl, when it comes to the way that they spend some of their cash in so many different ways, because the core business is still operating at such enormous levels of success at this point. Should that change, I think you might get a little bit more critical look at some of their acquisitions, although we'll see in time. They've had, certainly, as I said, some success as well. But I do think it's interesting. Larry Page, one of the first things he did when he took over was doing this deal, and he gets out of it. At other companies, for example, eBay, Meg Whitman bought Skype. It was John Donahoe who had to say, see you later, Skype. That deal didn't work. In this case, he has the confidence, that being Mr. say, all right, let's move on. Let's keep what we can, the value that we can potentially at least have taken here, and go on to fight another day.
One last point, John Steinberg. They report tonight, as we said with Kramer this morning, they don't have a stellar record of beating on actual earnings.
Yep.
Right? What do you expect tonight?
I think it's a rising tide lifts all boats. I mean, if you look at Kramer's whole motif of social mobile cloud, I think as a sector bet, like betting on oil or gold at the right time, that's how I view all these internet companies right now. It's transformative. All media is changing. I mean, if you look at Facebook, daily active users over monthly active users at an all-time high. Instagram doubling the amount of users to 180 million a month. More Google usage, more Android usage, more Amazon usage. That's what we're going to see across the board this earnings season.
All right, John Steinberg, thanks for joining us. BuzzFeed, John Fort, of course, as well, and I know David Faber, you're going to join us in a bit here on Time Warner Cable.